So, my background is in visual perception and individual differences in visual perception and mental imagery. And in about 2019, that's when I learned about aphantasia as a topic that you can investigate scientifically. However, over the course of the last few years of research, and as I'm sure many of you already know, a lot of aphantasia research has shown that there are not many objective differences in visual perceptual performance, or even classical psychological tasks that are thought to require mental imagery, like different types of visual memory and mental rotation tasks. The biggest differences we've found are in subjective experiences. So I've been really interested in the past couple of years looking deeper into the subjective experience of aphantasia and how this affects people's lives on a personal level. So the research we're going to be talking about today is on how aphantasia might affect people's mental health experiences. As we know from previous research, aphantasics are very unlikely to experience sensory symptoms like flashbacks and PTSD. And we wanted to understand more about these symptoms and how they impact mental health care experiences, such as evaluation and diagnosis. We also wanted to know what kind of therapies aphantasics have tried, like what works and what doesn't. So what we did was Bridget and I paired up with the Aphantasia Network, and we conducted a large-scale study that started with a questionnaire advertised via an article that we wrote for the network called Revisualizing the Role of Aphantasia in Mental Health Care. We asked a lot of questions about to what extent aphantasia impacts experiences with seeking mental health care and symptoms of different mental health conditions. And we gave this questionnaire to thousands of people, and maybe even some of you filled out this questionnaire through the aphantasia network. And we asked people about their mental imagery abilities. We also had quite a few people with hyperphantasia who filled out our questionnaire. That's extremely vivid and hyperrealistic imagery. So we got responses from people across the mental imagery spectrum. We asked about mental health evaluation and diagnosis experiences, and if they've ever had intrusive sensory and emotional experiences like flashbacks. And then we asked about the types of treatment that they sought, and also treatment success, and what mental health conditions they sought mental health care for. Overall, when we pre-processed the data and looked through all the questionnaire responses, we got 2,405 aphantasics who responded and 410 people with typical imagery to hyperphantasia, who we called our imager group for this study. And I'm just going to provide some bullet points on some of the findings that we got in the questionnaire. So first, in terms of demographics, we considered aphantasics to be those who scored less than a 3 out of 10 on a visual imagery vividness scale called the PSIQ. And then those who were part of the imagery group were those who had scores greater than 3 out of 10 on that scale. What you can see here in the figure is that each dot is an individual participant. The imagery group is shown in this peach color, and the aphantasics are shown in blue. You can see there's a wide diversity of visual imagery vividness scores of our participants, with most people clustering around the extremes, which is what we wanted to represent in this study. And we got a lot of responses across the world, most of them from the USA, Canada, UK, and Australia. But you can also see there were quite a few responses from other parts of the world, such as South America, African countries, Russia, India. And then we also asked people where they sought mental health care, and that was also mainly in Western countries. So just something to keep in mind as you listen to the presentation. We did try to diversify our demographics as much as possible, but this is mainly representative of the Western world. We also had a high proportion of female respondents. About 70% of our respondents identified as female. About 95% of our respondents had advanced or native English skills, and they came from middle class socioeconomic status. There was quite a bit of diversity in these demographic distributions, but there were actually no significant differences in these distributions between aphantasics and imagers, which is very good. So the groups were quite well matched. However, the aphantasia group was slightly older, not so much significantly older. But you can see from the graph here, where it says age in years, the aphantasics are shown in blue, and the imagers are shown in this peach color again, that there's a wider age range represented among the aphantasics, whereas the imagers tended to cluster more towards the younger side. And then we also had the highest level of education at the bottom here, broken down from primary or elementary school all the way to doctoral and professional degrees. And what you can see is that there is also a very similar distribution of educational attainment among aphantasics and imagers. So let's move on to some of the main results of the survey. So we asked participants to report from a list which mental health condition or conditions that they experienced, and participants could also write in their own responses if their condition wasn't on the list. First of all, I didn't include neurodiversity conditions here, since these are not considered mental health conditions, though the most common write-in conditions were autism and ADHD. And in case anyone is interested to know, there was also no difference in the prevalence of autism in our groups, which maybe settles the old misconception that autism is more prevalent in aphantasia. But importantly for our study, there was also no group difference in the prevalence of most mental health conditions, including depression and anxiety disorders, which are often thought to be exacerbated by mental imagery. And very interestingly, although you can see a small numerical increase in PTSD among imagers compared to aphantasics in our samples, this difference was not significant. So about 20% of our aphantasic sample had sought mental health support for PTSD, compared to 25% of imagers. There were two conditions that showed a significant difference in prevalence between aphantasics and imagers, and those were bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, both of which were more prevalent among the imagers. So it's been suggested that people with aphantasia may not experience intrusive imagery to the same extent as imagers, such as flashbacks and PTSD. And when we talk about intrusive imagery, it's usually in the context of PTSD flashbacks, but other disorders can have intrusions as a symptom as well, such as negative body image and eating disorders or worst case scenario intrusions in anxiety disorders. And generally, we found a higher prevalence of intrusions among imagers in our sample when we asked participants to report if they'd ever had an intrusive experience as part of their mental health condition. About 70% of aphantasics said no, whereas about 75% of imagers said yes. However, if we break down reports of intrusive experiences into different sensory modalities and also include reports of emotional intrusive experiences, we find that the biggest differences between aphantasics and imagers was in the visual domain, whereas there was no difference in the prevalence of emotional intrusions. Emotional intrusions were actually the most pervasive form of intrusions for both groups, and this includes invasive emotional experiences like waves of panic or sudden sadness related to thoughts and memories. So we thought that was a very interesting finding that people with aphantasia are not protected against emotional intrusions, which are the most common type of intrusions for both aphantasics and imagers. So then we broke down the prevalence of intrusions reported across different mental health conditions, and we found differences across the board between imagers and aphantasics. And this was particularly striking in PTSD, where over 90% of imagers experienced intrusions as part of their PTSD, whereas only 43% of aphantasics with PTSD ever experienced intrusions. So we expected this could be a major barrier in seeking mental health support and diagnosis, especially since flashbacks are considered a core symptom of PTSD. Next, we asked people about their experiences seeking a diagnosis for their mental health condition. Most aphantasics who had received a diagnosis believed they had been properly diagnosed, which was a pleasantly surprising finding considering the differences in mental health symptoms for aphantasics. Most of those who believed they had been properly diagnosed suspected they were diagnosed based on symptoms that were unaffected by aphantasia or unrelated to aphantasia. However, over half of aphantasics who did not feel they were properly diagnosed suspected that aphantasia may have delayed or prevented a diagnosis in some way. This was particularly true for aphantasics with PTSD, for which intrusive images are a core diagnostic symptom. So almost 75% of aphantasics with PTSD felt their proper diagnosis of PTSD was delayed or prevented because they did not have visual flashbacks. In terms of mental health evaluation experiences, 75% of aphantasics believed they had been properly evaluated for their mental health condition. But among those who felt they were misevaluated, more than half of those believed aphantasia may have factored into the misevaluation in some way, particularly due to a lack of understanding of aphantasia by mental health practitioners. Something else that it's important to be aware of is that many people only find out they have aphantasia long after they seek mental health care. So at the time of seeking an evaluation, it's not just the practitioner, but also the individual seeking treatment that might not be aware of their aphantasia. And this can be a potential barrier to effective evaluation and diagnosis. Finally, we wanted to know how many of our participants had tried cognitive behavioral therapy, also called CBT, which is currently the most common form of mental health treatment out there for a variety of disorders. So, CBT often relies very heavily on mental imagery techniques. So, we targeted this therapy specifically to gauge its perceived effectiveness among aphantasics and imagers. So first off, we found that about 70% of both imagers and aphantasics had tried CBT as part of their mental health treatment. However, among those who had tried CBT, there was a difference between aphantasics and imagers in the perceived effectiveness, with about 80% of imagers finding it at least somewhat effective, compared to about 60% of aphantasics. The type of CBT they tried included a visual imagery component. The perceived effectiveness of the treatment went down to 50% for aphantasics. However, if CBT included non-visual imagery techniques, its effectiveness went up to 72% for aphantasics, which was not significantly different from the perceived effectiveness of CBT for imagers. So if the practitioner did not rely on visual imagery in their CBT toolkit, it could be equally as effective for aphantasics and imagers. So to conclude, from the quantitative analysis of this survey, we found there was a similar prevalence of most mental health conditions for aphantasics and imagers. However, sensory intrusions like flashbacks are much more prevalent among imagers compared to aphantasics, which could contribute to delayed or prevented diagnosis in aphantasics, especially for those with PTSD, for which intrusive images are a core diagnostic symptom. And despite a similar proportion of aphantasics and imagers who've been referred for CBT, significantly fewer aphantasics found it effective as part of their mental health treatment. But a silver lining is that if practitioners focus on non-visual imagery techniques in their CBT protocol, it can be just as effective for aphantasics as imagers.